G'day everyone, welcome back to Frontlines and Faultlines with Mike Kelly. We have a real treat today in that we're going to be talking with a good friend of mine, Michael Scott CSC, Conspicuous Service Cross for those that don't know the military decoration. And we are very fortunate because Michael has such an amazing breadth of experience that he has the scar tissue to be able to comment on a lot of stuff. Everything from a lot of field experience, and Michael served for 30 years in the Australian Army, which is, that's pretty rare these days, I can tell you, but 30 years is a long time, and he had a lot of operational experience in our various deployments of recent years, which we can talk about with Michael. But in particular, he was part of the UNTSO team in the Middle East, the UN Truce Supervision organisation. And for those of you who don't know, Australia's been involved in that mission since it began, and it was the very first UN peacekeeping operation, if you want to call it that. And it's got elements of it posted all around the area of Israel, basically, and with its neighbours. And it's very important in the process of sort of trying to promote or encourage peace. And Michael ran that show for them, the military side of it, at various points. And so he's got amazing experience from his time there that we'll tap into. And then he came back here and did some tremendous work for the nation in relation to the land projects, land capability projects as Director of Land Capability. And he's finished up now, and so we get to try and draw on his experience and his capabilities in a whole new realm of areas of endeavour for him. So, Michael, welcome, mate. Great to have you here. Thanks for coming down from Sydney.
Mike, it's so nice to be here with you and the team. Thanks for having me.
No worries. So, when we look back on your experience, what was some of those operational circumstances too, the deployments you had apart from UNTSO?
Yeah, it's been an extraordinary 31 and a little bit years. Joined the Army at 17 out of Brisbane, turned 18 in week 7 break from recruit training in Kapuka. Right. Deployed to East Timor in 1999, Bougainville in 2003, Iraq during the surge in 2007, where I worked up in Baghdad, 2 tours of Afghanistan, Combat Team Command in 2011, and then back as a senior planner in Kabul in 2013-14. But I think that most particularly that led me here today was my 2 and a bit years living in Jerusalem with UNTSO, the head of military of a UN peacekeeping mission in command of 153 officers from 27 different troop contributing countries, and operating not only in Israel but up into Lebanon, Syria, Jordan and Egypt. Right. And very fortunate in my new capacity, that is the CEO and founder of a nascent global harm minimisation charity to combat antisemitism, yes. The 2023 Foundation, being back in Israel in September last year, where I got to see on the ground what the Israeli Defence Forces are doing in Gaza. Extraordinary experiences.
Yeah, and we're going to unpack that a lot, this new foundation too that you've really initiated it, and congratulations on that. And I think it reflects effectively your commitment to the nation and to causes and service, which is not going to leave us. I think you're going to be one of those slaves to service for the rest of your life. But also, you were OC of 3/4 Cav, which of Bravo Squadron 3/4 Cav, which is it resonates with me greatly because. They were the subunit I served with in Somalia alongside Spike McCaskill and the crew. So it's been around 3/4 Cav, but and Bravo Squadron in particular. So, mate, amazing record of service. So when we come to unpack that a bit, I guess what are the things you really learned most out of that experience? The things that shaped you and took away from them all?
Yeah, I think I've always had a sense of service, and so it was a very easy transition from being a military professional in the profession of arms, where I always found that I got a lot through the vector of giving without any expectation in return. One of the things that I truly loved about my first career, that is the profession of arms and command, is working with people. Of course, Australian soldiers can get into all sorts of mischief from time to time. time. But that's part of the joy and the burden and the privilege and honour of commanding Australian soldiers. As we were looking at preparing for a combat deployment as part of mentoring Task Force 3 to southern Afghanistan,
right,
when I was Officer Commanding B Squadron 3-4 Cav, we got a hit in the flank with Tropical Cyclone Yasi.
Right.
But I think that there's so many crossovers between service in the military and what I'm seeing now in the private sector and charity work, that there's an internal and an external locus of control, the best laid plans of mice and men. So where I'd mapped a training program to ready and prepare force elements for war such that we minimised regret and maximised the potentiality of mission success within acceptable risk parameters. Right. Tropical Cyclone Yasi dumped a huge amount of water in North Queensland, and I had to reset and dynamically adapt. And that's certainly some of the passion I'm taking into my second career as a founder of a charity.
Right. Yeah. Well, that sort of disaster response experience we've kind of teased out a bit in our conversations because we consider it part of the national security challenge, and obviously you were literally up to your eyeballs in it in the water.
Yeah.
So major challenge, Cyclone Yasi. I know it was not a great response from the Navy at the time because of the failure to invest in the sustainment and maintenance of the AORs. And one of the shocking things we found in government was we couldn't mobilise a single one of them to help us meet that disaster. So I think that was a bit of an awakening of having to reset where we were at with our entire shipbuilding and ship and sustainment sort of strategy. So you've had an experience across all of these things, so I hope that we do continue to take advantage of all that scar tissue. It's very important, real experience, real life experience. And in that respect, we've been watching an incredible dynamic over the last year and a half as the Australian public tries to digest and understand everything that's been going on in the Middle East, and we've been really focused here on trying to unpack that and Ukraine and China and all these issues, give them some baseline to form their opinions off. Yeah. But, this aspect, this issue, this Middle East situation in particular, has been a fertile ground for a lot of misinformation. It's serving purposes and other agendas. Obviously the Marxist elements here have really tried to, I guess, take that issue hostage for their own sort of gains and intentions and agendas. But it's muddied the waters on exactly what is going on. And I know you've been there to learn those lessons. You've seen things on the ground. You've walked the ground with nothing more important than that. And we've talked to Lord Roberts about the events of the 7th of October, but you've seen the sites and you've been with the military to understand the challenges and dynamics of the urban terrain and the nature of that fighting. So can we just firstly get your observations of that factual reality, what was actually going on and what the challenge is and what the intent of the enemy is in this space too, in terms of Hamas and Hezbollah, etc.?
Yeah. So just coming back a bit to set the context, I think that in the 1990s there were two philosophies that are now in tension. One was Francis Fukuyama, The End of History, where there was a perception, well-meaning, that after the Iron Curtain came crashing down, we could all sing Kumbaya because history of mankind has ended. And we'd live in
stupidest phrase I have ever heard.
Yeah, and it's been disproven from everything we've seen since. But a counter-narrative that was pilloried at the time was put forward firstly in Foreign Affairs or Foreign Wars Journal by Samuel Huntington, A Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order. He developed that into a book in 1996. And so for your listeners, I'd certainly encourage you to read Fukuyama's End of History and Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. But as you've talked to, as someone that has spent time in the Middle East as well, there's such a contra-narrative going on, not only in Australia but across the West. I think that there's a misperception that Maslow's hierarchy 1, safety, security and survival, was something that our parents and our grandparents looked on, to the extent that when we think through October 7, the reality, when we look at the story of mankind, the piece that we understood October 6, 2023, and so the last 20 years before that, that was atypical in the story of human history. Tragically, sadly, and I say that as a father and as a humanist, what happened on October 7 is the story of mankind. And I think that the contra-narratives have really smacked us in the face. And when I look at the implications to Australia, twofold. A third book that I'd recommend the readers dust off again is George Orwell's 1984. I think objectively the only thing that amazing futurist got wrong was he mistitled 1984. It should have been titled 2024, because one of the things we're seeing is otherwise reasonable, open-minded people are absolutely convinced that 2 + 2 = 5. And that's a real problem. And part of the reason that I'm doing the work that I'm involved in, see a need, meet a need, is that having lived in Israel and spending time not only with Jewish Israelis, but Druze and Arab Christians and Muslims, what we hear on some of our previously credible media institutions and what people are being led to believe in our schools and universities, it's gaslighting and projection of Orwellian proportion. And that came starkly into focus for me on the morning of the 10th of October 2023. That's where I turned on the news and I saw what happened at our Opera House the night before, chants of gas the Jews and F the Jews. And that's when I looked at my wife and said, sweetheart, I can't be a bystander. I'm going to do something. And that led me on the path to founding the 2023 Foundation.
Right. And look, so, this is the first threshold thing. We get this thrown in our face, this disaster, shocking situation, which you understood the facts of. But to step back, when we sort of look at this in the context of the broader dynamics and operational threat that this is all part of, that unique perspective you got with UNTSO for those 2 years, you can't buy that. So can you take us through, unpack that whole 2-year experience, what you observed literally as an observer, and the dynamics that exist in the Middle East that people just don't appreciate properly?
You bet. It was a finishing school from the geopolitical level through to strategy, operations and tactics. And so military officers have to rage or move through those cognitive lenses, as you well know. As deploying to the UNTSO as the military deputy to a Norwegian Major General, it was an amazing experience where I headed the military pillar.
And what years was those?
July 2019 to September 2021, so 8 months before COVID, and then through to coming back into Australia during lockdown, where I actually found it easier to get from Jerusalem into Damascus than I did from Canberra up into Brisbane.
Right.
But that's another story. I got a front row seat of watching the great game play out in the Levant, an area of strategic significance between the Russian bear, the American eagle, and the Chinese panda. As someone that has been apolitical the whole of my military career, I was one of the people that ambassadors and senior people from not only P5 nations, but the 27 troop contributing countries that had military officers serving in UNTSO would come and speak with. For those that have watched the Levant for the last 3,000 years, it's been quite uneventful, and that was my experience over 27 months. It felt at one stage in the lead up to the Abraham Accords like we'd tip into a third intifada. There was that huge bomb blast in Beirut on the 4th of August 2020, where I had a couple of my observers within the lethal radius. It was just good drills that kept these individuals alive.
Right. Was this the port blast?
Yeah. In my judgment, the largest non-nuclear blast in the history of mankind.
Imagery
although what happened in Operation Rising Lion last month, that may actually require me to think through it. But at the time, there was 4,000 tonnes tonnes of chemical fertiliser, ammonium nitrate, something that you and I know, unfortunately, too well from our service in Iraq and Afghanistan. Syria was a schmozzle then. There was a civil war. It hasn't ended. It looked at one stage like Egypt and Ethiopia would go to war over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. There was a palaver with Libya as well on the west of Egypt. And I needed to keep across not only the dynamics of the Eastern Mediterranean, where some of the petrochemicals under the surface were being jockeyed over, but things like Nagorno-Karabakh and Yemen. One of the be prepared tasks that my mission had, because we were all officers and within the broader UN construct, we were considered one of the best UN missions. I had a be prepared task to react officers to emerging contingencies globally, and something I've always taken very seriously was an individual acceptance of responsibility. If I was directed from the United Nations in New York, the Permanent Five and the Security Council to force assign observers to an emerging contingency, I wasn't going to do that without the correct CMAP and the due diligence that we would expect an officer in the Australian military would take to Australian men and women under our command. And so it really gave me incredible understanding of the geopolitics and the interplay between nation states, including superpowers, right down to some of the tactical realities on the ground operating in southern Lebanon, in Damascus and other parts of the contested space.
Right. Was there a particular area you spent the most focus on during that time?
I think the two focal areas were the South Litani River sector, southern Lebanon, as well as the area of separation between the Golan, east of the Hula Valley in northern Israel, and also southwestern Syria. They were the areas that I needed to focus on. That was where, in my judgment, the greatest risk to the life of my observers were. But one of the realities in the profession of arms is that complacency, in my judgment, is the biggest killer. Amazing things, extraordinary things were happening all the time, including Hamas and PIJ, sleeper cells in Judah and Samaria, the area that is known as the West Bank. My observers would often transit in close proximity or even through from Jericho, either north or south on Route 90. And so something that I've learnt through my first career is that on the horns of a dilemma, I'll do what in time I regret less. And part of the dual responsibility of officers in steady state is not only to achieve the mission, but it's to do that without undue risk to the safety and security of personnel under my command. And it's something I took very seriously. And indeed, looking back retrospectively, not only my time in Israel and the 5 countries of the mission area, but also my experiences in Iraq, in Afghanistan, while at time, I didn't bring everyone home alive that I deployed with in Afghanistan, but where I can, I mourn the loss of my soldiers. When I look at myself in the mirror or I'm woken up at 2 a.m. in the morning, I'm not haunted with regret because I'm clear in my conscience that I've done everything I could, not only to drive towards the mission and end state, but doing it without any cavalier action on behalf of the officers and soldiers under my command.
Right. Well, and you used the reference to the geographic location of the Litani River. That will resonate with Australian history because my family were there in the First World War with Light Horse, but also there in the Second World War during the Syria-Lebanon campaigns. And we'll be talking a lot about the Australian experience, on the ground in Palestine, as it was called during the mandate. But the key dynamic for you, which would have kept you awake at night, literally, would have been that presence of Hezbollah there. And, of course, you've got UN colleagues not far away as well in UNIFIL, and they were operating under a new mandate, UN resolution produced after the 2006 confrontation between Israel and Hezbollah. And the theory behind that resolution, 1702, I think it was
1701,
1701, which is that they were supposed to evacuate that whole area and be replaced by the Lebanese army. And throughout the entire time of UNIFIL 2's presence there, it didn't happen. And then, so then people say, Israel's got to let UNIFIL continue and get on with its mission. However, they'd failed over many, many years. Since 2006 to 2024, they'd failed in that mission. But that just brings to the surface, though, this whole dynamic of Hezbollah and who pays their rent and what relationship they have. And maybe you could talk us through what is Hezbollah and what is that relationship.
Yeah, it's certainly complex human terrain. And for those that are interested, looking back at the actual United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701 that was signed into effect after the Second Lebanon War in 2006, and some of the realities of a resolution signing into effect. It was at the time of Bush 2, so a Republican in the States that was very keen to establish what one could colloquially refer to as a hairy-chested resolution.
Right.
But within the Security Council, there's 5 nations that have veto powers, and unfortunately some of the P5 nations with veto powers have got some form when it comes to the Levant. And so the US, I believe, wanted to put forward a resolution that would actually achieve strategic outcomes and keep Hezbollah out. But that was never going to be agreed by the Russians, the Chinese, and unfortunately the French, who have got some form in that area. And so what was signed into effect, I think, sowed the seeds of its own demise,
right.
Where an officer like me, I was trained as a cavalry officer to do sector searches, our mission essential task lists. On my handover when I was first up in the South Litani River sector, speaking with senior leaders at the United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon with my predecessor, and actually talking through with my team leaders how they actually deported themselves. It was lunacy when I read in that they couldn't move off assigned routes, they couldn't enter private property. And so for those that are interested in understanding a little bit more about why good money was thrown after bad and nothing effectively was achieved, there were sites called Green Without Borders. Hezbollah and malevolent force elements used our interests in the West, where they were talking about planting trees that just happened to be on strategic sites.
Right.
Of course, between the trees were Hezbollah observation posts and Radwan Forces infrastructure.
Right.
My observers weren't allowed to go into those areas. They got reported to the UN, but right. if there's not an appetite to do anything with those reports, there's not an appetite to do anything with those reports. And that's where we see the crazy situation where Hezbollah infrastructure was right up to and in some cases underneath UN infrastructure.
Right.
For the majority, United Nations Interim Force in Lebanon are professional military officers from a number of countries, just like my force elements were, and indeed me. I saw straight away that my role as an apolitical military officer assigned from the Australian Army to the United Nations Truce Supervision organisation ultimately was to do myself out of a job, to assist with the terms of peace so that we get out of there. But unfortunately, the United Nations is a whopping great big bureaucracy. There's a lot of intentions there, some unfortunately malevolent, but the roll-up from all of my experiences are that, in my judgment, the countries of the world, particularly with how out of balance our budgets and the debt is, that we can no longer afford to throw good money after bad by paying gold into missions that aren't actually working to its intended purpose. Right. And so again, I'm not involved in the decision parameters of what that may mean in either Turtle Bay, the headquarters in the UN in New York, or within the member countries, but objectively I would see that ceasing and desisting with that mission is a defensible next step given everything we've known since October 2023 to the current.
Yeah, well, particularly UNIFIL, the stories of, and I've seen the vision of, as you say, the Hezbollah launch locations, tunnels, entrances for entering into Israel and conducting terrorist attacks right under their noses, and literally underneath them at times. And so that flew completely in the face of that mission and its mandate and what they were supposed to be doing. And so it doesn't give you a lot of faith, in the ability of the UN in recent times to deliver on security arrangements and peacekeeping options.
If we look at deterrence, I think objectively that if Hezbollah were to encroach south of the Litani sector towards the northern border or the blue line between Lebanon and Israel, the Israeli Defence Force, with their image intelligence, signals intelligence and human intelligence, is tremendous up in Lebanon. And I think deterrence is that if there's terrorist activity, a bomb is dropped on them and they cease and desist. I think that practically that's one of the ways that we can deter future encroachment. That you might have more up-to-date information than me, but last year when I looked at the circumstances in the north, Metula, Safat, Kiryat Shimona, I think there were about 70 or 80,000 Israeli families that were displaced from the north, not only based on the rockets, but the real risk that Hezbollah, if they penetrated south into northern Israel, they would commit the atrocities like we saw Hamas committing in the envelope in the south west of Israel. The level of radicalization of the Shia terrorists, Hezbollah up in Lebanon, as well as Muslim Brotherhood, not only in Judea and Samaria but in Gaza, it's without precedent. I don't think that the Hitler Youth was so ideologically twisted as the Arabs of the Levant or the Shia up in Lebanon have been, and it's quite troubling to me that your taxpayers' dollars and mine that went into the United Nations Relief and Works Agency has been partially responsible for that level of radicalisation.
Indoctrination, it's the school materials we're talking about here are just heinous and proven, and the European Parliament's produced about 5 reports drilling down on that and ringing the bell, but people continue to provide funding.
And just to give the listeners context, schools are taught arithmetic. If you've got 2 dead Jews and you murder another 2 Jews, how many dead Jews do you have? Yes, Fatima, teacher, we've got 4 dead Jews. It's actually without precedent, and I think that as we as a people move through major operations in Gaza, and we get to circle back and understand some of the causal factors that led not only to the worst pogroms since the Shoah, since the genocide of the Holocaust in the Second World War, that is October 7, 2023, some of the causal factors I think will be the West funding the United Nations elements that led to that level of fanaticism. It's deeply dispiriting as not only a taxpayer, but as a father and as a humanist that lived in Israel and formed deep personal connections, not only with Jewish Israelis, but Druze, Arab Muslims and Christians.
And so, there's obviously been a long history of Hezbollah since the 80s in Lebanon, and it's a long story of how they've distorted the situation in Lebanon and the corrosion of Lebanese sovereignty that has taken place there. But there is someone pulling strings behind Hezbollah, and I don't know if you had much opportunity to sort of see that in practice in UNTSO, but can you comment on that?
Not seen in practice, but one of the things that military officers all need to keep an eye to is politically aware but apolitical. And so it was no secret that Iran was actively funding a number of the malevolent force elements. Hezbollah, Shia up in Lebanon. They were also funding Sunni terrorist Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza. Not only Hamas but Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the Houthi rebels in Yemen. other malevolent force elements in Iraq, Syria. That was at one stage a Shia crescent where there was a supply pipeline from Iran through Iraq, through Syria to Lebanon, where the real concern was that there were tens of thousands of rockets, many of them were guided, and other anti-ship missiles in Lebanon, all aimed at Israel or the ships in the Eastern Mediterranean. That was the case when I was back in Israel in 2024. It was the case when I was there from 2019 to 2021. That was a really troubling dynamic, and I think those that are interested to actually understand how well the Israeli Defence Forces did, it beggars belief. We are living in a period of historical significance where the actions not only to eliminate the terrorist Nasrallah, but Radwan forces and some of the rockets in Lebanon, as well as Operation Rising Lion in June 2025 against the Iranian nuclear program and the ballistic missile program. I think that'll be studied in West Point and other military academies for generations. Yeah,
look, that's a great baseline for our following on conversation that we'll be having, and we'll unpack the military lessons learned out of a lot of this as well in the next program, and then talk about what you've been motivated to do and how you see that operating and the support that you'll need to make that vision come to reality and fruition. So thanks, Michael. Look forward to talking to you in the next session, and I hope you really got a lot out of that. What we're talking about here is someone with boots on the ground, eyeball experience, and ground truth is how we would describe it in the military. So these are the sorts of voices that we want people to be hearing, because we don't hear any of it in the mainstream media at the moment. And so we'll continue the conversation in the next session. So thanks for being with us. Cheers.